Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed, as created by Obsidian Entertainment. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you all for listening. Let's get into today's lore. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. If you find yourself new to the show and you're wondering what Pillars of Eternity has to do with Avowed, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so, as the theory goes, if we dive into those first two Pillars of Eternity games, we can glean insights into the world that Avowed is going to be played in. As well, for those of us who just love the Pillars of Eternity games, it's a chance for us to get back together and just explore a world that we know and love. If you have not been to this show before, first off, welcome to the show. Happy to have you here. This is a little passion project I started a few years ago and found that it just kept on running strong, so hopefully you enjoy it. If you're curious on some of the best places to start, because there are a lot of episodes, I'm going to signpost you to episode 0, which will give you a list of episodes that are kind of the best to start off with if you're wanting a foundation for the world's lore. Although today will be a decent episode to start on, I am going to be doing a lot of speculating in today's episodes. I'm going to try to stay spoiler-free for those who want to experience Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 for themselves. If there are any spoilers, I'll make sure to give a heads up, and I'll also include a little musical interlude to give you a chance to jump off the episode. But I'm planning to try to skirt around a lot of direct spoilers. So if you are new to today's episode, you might get a little lost, not because it's not beginner-friendly, but because I'm going to be speculating based off of a bunch of different pieces of lore from the Pillars of Eternity games and what we've been seeing in recent Avowed gameplay. In today's episode, my speculations are going to basically be centering around the idea of what kind of godlike character we are, what entity is behind the voice that we've seen in recent gameplay footage, and maybe how that all connects to the Dream Scourge. I put out a post on Reddit asking for some theories about the voice, and I got a few responses that I'd like to read from those of you who are in the community. As well, I have a few theories myself. I really don't know where to settle on a lot of these theories, because some of them have quite a lot of good logic and reasoning to it, but they clearly don't overlap very well. So I'm genuinely confounded. I don't know where Obsidian is going with some of this narrative stuff. I do think some things are very obviously linked together, but I don't know in what way. A little bit of housekeeping to get out of the way before we start into the episode. One is that up here in Canada, there has been a postal workers strike, and I work in the courier/delivery business as a UPS person, so I have been obscenely busy. I'm talking 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and on top of that, I have other regular adult responsibilities, so I'm sorry that my episodes have not been very normal in their cadence. I am basically able to record one episode 1 week and then try to just scramble to edit it in time for the second week. So I thank everyone for your patience, and hopefully as the Christmas season reaches its peak and then starts to wane off into January, I'll be able to re-enter into the regular cadence of one episode per week. I did scrub through a lot of my old files on my Audacity folder, and I found some old recordings that I recorded a long time ago, and I'm going to try to collect some of that together to just make sure I have episodes for you guys. But I thank you for your patience. If you're wondering why I haven't been releasing as much as I normally do, that's the reason why. And until a lot of this volume goes down, if I'm doing 70-hour work weeks, I'm not going to be able to keep up with that. So thank you for your patience in that regard. Now, involving news for Avowed or anything related to that, which I know is part of the reason you're all listening to this, there's not actually a lot that I have to discuss. There was some news a couple weeks ago, but it's a little far out at this point in time, and you've all mostly heard of it. But I will go over some of it here. Obviously, the big piece of news, if you didn't listen to the previous episode, is that there was a lot of gameplay footage released by people who had been given early builds of the game, and they got to play the introduction of Avowed. They weren't allowed to show us the prologue area, which I kind of inferred was this area called Fort Northreach, and we weren't allowed to see character creator, but we were allowed to see the opening hours in a place called Dawnshore. And there was a lot of information to glean from that, way more than I could include in one episode, but it's also a very list form, so I'm not going to just list all that stuff in today's episode. However, some people have received their maps from the Steelbook edition that you can pre-order for Avowed, and we have learned that there are 5 regions in Avowed. There is Dawnshore, Emerald Stair, Shatterscarp, Gallowayne's Tusks, and a place called The Garden, which I'm really interested in because I think it correlates to some lore that we know from the Pillars of Eternity games, especially since we see an item in the Dawnshore area that one of the players had in their inventory that might relate to it. So that's a piece of news. There are 5 regions, it seems, there's going to be in Avowed. There might be more sub-regions, like specific areas for specific quests, but as far as like overarching maps goes, this seems to be what we have. And if they're all expansive as Dawnshore seems to be, it seems like there's going to be a lot of game to chew through. Some people were saying that just in Dawnshore alone, they had 20 hours worth of content. So this game seems like it might have a hefty amount of game to go through, which is, me personally, I'm looking forward to smaller experiences of games, but that's just because of my personal lifestyle and circumstances. I definitely understand people looking forward to having more meat to chew through in this game. Other pieces of news, I don't know if this is necessarily news, but it was an article that I found really interesting. It had to do with there being missable content in video games, particularly in Avowed. So the game of Avowed is going to feature missable content, and I don't necessarily mean missable content in the sense of like, oh, you missed this chance to get this achievement or this trophy, so now you have to replay the game if you want to get it. I'm talking more along the ideas of the game is so expansive in how it presents quests to you and how you will play through the narrative that there's a good chance in your first playthrough that you will miss content in the game. And I think that has more to do, again, not with you not being thorough enough of a gamer, but more in the sense of like they have set up the world in such a way that the decisions you make will lead to certain things happening in the world that would otherwise not happen if you didn't choose them. So if you choose option A versus option B, perhaps in a quest, or if you perform action A versus action B, it'll change the world around you, which will dramatically change your experience of the game and its narrative. So that sounds like there's missable content in the sense of like there are different world states even. I'm speculating a little bit here, but I like things like this. I know a lot of gamers, especially completionists, you like to get every piece of content wrung out of a game in one playthrough, but I like this idea that there are going to be novel and new experiences for a second or third playthrough even. That is something that excites me because I do like to revisit games, but I hate just grinding through a lot of the same narrative over and over again to get to the slight variations. So I'm excited to see what Obsidian's planning to do. The last piece of news, because I am recording this after the Game Awards, is that, and this isn't this isn't Avowed related, this is specifically Obsidian related, is that we're getting the Outer Worlds 2 supposedly in 2025. I don't know if any of you were watching the Game Awards and you saw that announcement, but that blew my socks off when I saw that not only do they have the Outer Worlds 2 way further along than I thought they did in development, they're actually going to release the game the same year as Avowed. So this is going to be a really stacked year for Obsidian. It makes me a little, I don't know, not sad, but a little melancholy in the sense of like, does that mean that there's not going to be any Obsidian content for several years after 2025? But then again, I have heard Obsidian state numerous times that they have seen a lot of value in creating smaller projects. So I'm hoping that they have some small projects on the go, which actually makes me even more like excited to see what kind of things they might be creating in the background while these 2 flagship titles are being developed and released. So The Outer Worlds 2, if for some reason you might not be aware, is another one of the IPs that Obsidian owns. It's a sci-fi game, much in the same vein as like a Fallout style of game, except it's in space, and it's not a post-war America kind of a situation, but like a lot of similar mechanics that you might be used to. And I'm excited to see how they like implement their new action and combat systems in the game. The engine and all that, like what we saw at the Game Awards trailer, it seemed like the game was running in a very samey kind of way to the Outer Worlds 1. But I guess if they've also refined a lot of those processes and experiences, I enjoyed the Outer Worlds. I really did. I didn't think that it had the same meat on the bones in terms of world building that like Avowed did, but they were also 2 separate experiences. Like it wasn't trying to deliver this massive full fantasy world in the same way. You can't even have the same level of lore. So I think that might just be personal taste. But I did enjoy The Outer Worlds. I platinumed that game on PlayStation, and then again on Xbox. Like, I absolutely love that game. So I'm really looking forward to The Outer Worlds 2. That's everything that I need to mention today in this intro part. Sorry, we're already 10 minutes in, at least in my recording. So let's dive into the lore, which is mostly going to be speculative, for today's episode.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
All right, so some things to get out of the way before we dive into the speculation. I'm mostly going to be talking about 3 different aspects of things we see in Avowed, and I'm going to be pulling lore from the Pillars of Eternity games to help explain them. The first thing is an entity called the Voice, which I talked about at length in the previous episode near the end of the episode, so I won't do a long explanation of that here. Suffice to say that basically your player character in Avowed, you hear this voice in your head early on in the game as you approach the island or continent of the Living Lands. So obviously there's something associated with that there. I'm also going to be talking about our status as a godlike creature within this world, which is a unique kind of sub-race that exists within the world of Eora. I'll talk about that in a second. And lastly, I might touch on the Dream Scourge a little bit. I'm a little more unsure about what's going on with the Dream Scourge. I originally had theorized that the Dream Scourge was a positive force behind the deity that is behind your godlike status, but I'm not 100% sure if that's true anymore. But it still is interesting, and it kind of connects to a few theories we have. So to discuss what these things are, when I'm talking about the Voice, I'm mostly going to be talking about it in the sense that it is a divine being. It is a god. Now, gods in this world have an interesting history and origins. If you're interested in hearing about that, I do several episodes on the gods of Eora, some of which are spoilery, but some of which are not. Feel free to peruse those at your leisure. But the commonly known gods in the world of Eora are the Ingwithan pantheon, which are 11 different gods that exist within this world. And the gods are associated to the godlike. Godlikes are people within the world that are touched or blessed, depending on, I guess, the culture they're born into, touched by the gods while they're in the womb of their parent. And so you might have 2 normal parents, humans or elves or dwarves, etc., and they will give birth to a child, but this child will be god-touched by one of those 11 Ingwithan gods. And these people are born into the world. They have the same, I guess you could call shape and physiology as their parents do, right? So if you're an elven child, in a sense, you will kind of grow up a little more slender and slightly less tall than a human might be, but you're going to have a physiology and a visage that mimics the god that blessed you. Right, so if, for example, you are blessed by Magrin, the goddess of fire and war, you will be born very likely as a fire godlike, and you might have a bunch of different traits about you as a result of this. You could have fire for hair. Your skin might be like obsidian rock. You might have cracks in your skin that's glow orange, like there's a fire or a furnace underneath you. You might have sparks trailing behind you as you walk throughout the world. You could have demon horns. Your eyes might have glowing flames instead of black pupils, all these different physiological traits of being a fire god, blessed by the goddess of fire. And this can happen for any of the 11 gods within the world. And so your character being a godlike means that they have been god-touched by one of the gods within this world. The thing is, though, is that we don't yet have a god that is associated with fungus very directly like we do with some other things. And so we've seen through a lot of gameplay footage as well as interviews that our character's godlike status is associated with fungus in some way, shape, or form. And that can be related to a number of different gods. It could be related to Wall, for example, because there is a DLC in the second Pillars of Eternity game where Wall is heavily themed and fungus is also a big important part of that DLC. Now, granted, it's still a little bit distinct and separate from the god itself, but the themes are still there. As well, mushrooms are part of nature, and so you could be related to the god Galawain, which is heavily associated with nature. Although you could also think of fungus as a expression of decay, which would be related to the god Remergon, who is the god of decay and entropy and the unraveling of all things and bad luck, etc., etc. And so it could be related to that. But it could also be something else. It might not be one of these 11 gods. Obsidian has set up this world in such a way that there could be other entities out there that might have power that rivals that of the gods, even though they're not part of the Ingwithan pantheon as we understand the deities to exist within this world. And I'll try to explain that a little bit more later. And lastly, as far as the Dream Scourge goes, we don't really know a lot about it. We know that it's kind of like people, their souls, especially the stuff that souls are made of, which is called essence. So if I refer to capital E, essence, that's the stuff that souls are made of in this world. And it's not just people that have souls or essence. It is even like trees and rocks and dirt and the ambient air around you. There is essence that can be pulled from there. And essence can also be put into things, especially this gemstone called Adra, which can house essence within it very naturally. It's kind of close to soul gems like you might see in the Elder Scrolls, but it doesn't work the exact same way. People use soul gems a little more mechanically in that world than they do here. I don't have time to get into it directly, but if that's a quick analog for you to understand it, then we'll go with that for now. The Dream Scourge, as I've understood it from different parts of the lore, it's like a waking nightmare. So I've always thought of it as in this way of like your soul, your essence that's in your body gets infected with whatever this Dream Scourge is, and it starts making dreams, or I don't know if it's your dreams or the dreams of others or the dreams of something that you are now perceiving. And so you are now kind of mistaking the real world for the dream world in the sense. There isn't like a dream world like you would find in a lot of other fantasy settings, at least that I'm aware of. So how that's particularly being expressed, I don't know. But that idea that like these people who are infected with the Dream Scourge are, how I'm understanding it anyways, based off what we're reading and inferring, is that they are basically living out a nightmare in the world. They're kind of like asleep in a way, and they're just living in this nightmare where they become these like ravenous beasts. And in the real world, their body is getting overrun by what looks to be like fungus, which makes me think that it's connected to whatever your godlike is connected to. And since you have this voice that is talking in your head, I'm kind of surmising that the voice is also the deity or the divine being that touched you in a god-touched way, so that you were born as this particular fungal godlike. So now, with all of that like foundational lore and ideas out of the way, let's go over some interesting theories that people have had, and then I'll kind of collect my own theories by the end.
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
So I posted something on the Avowed subreddit asking any thoughts on the voice. So I'm basically asking people what they thought the entity behind the voice is. And I also touch on the idea of like it might have something to do with our godlike nature. And there were a decent amount of responses, and I'm going to go through most of them here. User Jeraphiel, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, Jeraphiel, says, I have zero evidence for this, but my main theory is that the Living Lands itself is a forgotten god, or at least it is an immense avatar of a lost nature / life god. I think the Forgotten Sanctum pushed to the absolute extreme. The fungi imagery that may represent a corruption of some sort that is spreading, and it is up to a single godlike to cleanse it. Again, zero evidence, but the idea just came to me the other day during a conversation about godlikes. So what Jeraphael here is talking about is the setting for the game of Avowed is on a place called the Living Lands, which is a continent or just a large island. It's basically the place that the game is set on. And he's talking about this idea that a lot of people have been echoing, that the Living Lands itself is actually a living thing. It has its own essence, or it has its own consciousness, like it is its own person or groups of people maybe. In some way or shape or form, the Living Lands is itself alive. And in particular, he's saying here that it itself is a god. And there's a lot of ideas that could support this within the lore. If perhaps essence was congregating all together somewhere in the world, perhaps it evolved a level of consciousness, and because all that essence is correlated to the Living Lands itself, where it all came from, the Living Lands might have some sort of consciousness behind it. So the Living Lands being a deity is definitely one possible theory, and the Dream Scourge might be something that is slowly eating away at the essence within the Living Lands, and that's why it's really important to figure out what's going on, at least to the Living Lands if it is a god. User Morfurs, Morfeurs, says, I think it's a Lengrith situation. Now, to understand a little bit of what's going on there, you need to know a little bit more about Lengrith. I've done an episode on Lengrith, that's Lengrath, if you want to go search through my episodes to find that. The thing that's interesting about Lengrith is, one, Lengrith is an archmage in this world, and an archmage in the world of Eora is basically just a very powerful mage. But they're specifically on a council of mages that oversee some of the more esoteric knowledge of the world, and they're often involved in some of the biggest worldwide events that have to do with Eora. And we interact with them a lot in the Forgotten Sanctum DLC that was referenced earlier in the second Pillars of Eternity game. These archmages have lots of hidden knowledge. They are often have their fingers involved in things that could have cataclysmic or world-shaking implications. And they are also very powerful as far as mages go, often trying to perform experiments or learn things about the world, like how to be immortal or something like that. Lengrith is a really interesting addition to the Archmage Council because I'm not really sure, they are kind of like different iterations of themselves, is kind of the way I'm going to put it without spoiling too much about their character if you want to discover more about them naturally. But there are like different iterations of Lengrith where essentially the previous Lengrith puts all of themselves into the next iteration of themselves, so that the next person who calls themselves Lengrith essentially has all the personhood of the previous Lengriths, but they are also distinctly themselves. It's kind of how I understand it. I might be a little incorrect on the lore there. But this person here, Morphurs, is correlating the idea behind the voice to Lengrith in the sense that it is kind of a collection or different iterations of previous people, perhaps. As well, there is also a connection to some of the fungus in the Forgotten Sanctum DLC, but I'm going to dive into that because it's a little spoilery for that DLC. But there's definitely this idea that the voice, especially since it refers to itself as a we, is that perhaps it is a collection of these previous iterations of whatever it is, and it continues growing in that capacity off of previous knowledge, and it kind of lives on immortally in that way. And there's definitely a lot of credibility to that idea, especially since we do see a character, Lengrith, who pulls this off. A user, TinkityTonk_oldfruit, says it's gotta be the Reverend Mommy Lady Jessica, which I'm pretty sure is referring to Resident Evil. That would be quite the crossover. I don't think that's what the case is, but hey, you never know. What a twist. That would be a twist. I'm going to say, nobody would see that coming except for TinkityTonk_oldfruit. Another user, Urban or Urbane Beulah, or is it Urban Ebula? I think Urban Ebula is how it's pronounced. URBANEBULA says, anyone played Hollow Knight? I'm getting an inkling of some striking similarities between the two stories. He then goes on to say that some stuff about Hollow Knight, and then has a little spoilery section here, which I didn't read because I actually haven't played Hollow Knight yet, and I do want to play it, so I haven't actually touched on it yet. So the only reason I'm including it here is because if any of you listening have played Hollow Knight all the way to the end, perhaps you know what he's talking about. He says, Hollow Knight takes place in an ancient city of Hallownest. The city has long fallen into ruin, but the husks of the former citizens and creatures still roam the caverns, controlled by a fungal plague that invades their dreams. And then he gets into the spoiler stuff, so I don't read beyond that. But anyone who's played Hollow Knight, if you have any idea what's going on, feel free to hit me up a message at World of Eora on Twitter or worldoferor@gmail.com if you want to expand on that in a spoiler-free way, I would request, as to what's going on, because maybe there is some similarities there. I'm willing to bet a lot of people out of Obsidian have played Hollow Knight, and so they might have been influenced by some of those narratives. And the last comment that I'm going to go through here is a bit of a big one. It's by dbones90, a top 1% commenter on the Avowed Reddit. And they have quite the theory here, so let's go through this bit by bit. The biggest question related to the voice and your godlike status is, why now? We know the living gods have sucked up all their godlikes, and that has something to do with the end of the Deadfire game. There's also our fungal theme. We know that the fungus isn't a theme of any existing godlike. Even Gallowayne's nature godlikes have been more about trees and fauna than mushrooms. Based on previous footage, we know that there's a group of ancient people called the Godless, and we're going to be exploring their temples and ruins in Avowed. But why do the Godless have ruins? Is it for the same reason that the Ingwithans did? The Ingwithans, by the way, this is a sidebar, are an ancient civilization of people that we explore the ruins of in the first and second Pillars of Eternity game, and they're very important to the narratives that we see in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. And so dbones90 here is kind of drawing a correlation to maybe the Godless have a similar history, or why did they have ruins? Like, we know why the Ingwithans had some of their ruins, which again, spoiler stuff for the first game, I'm not going to talk about it, but do the Godless have ruins for similar reasons? So and that's dbones90, is going to make a wild theory that might be more fan fiction than fact, but I think this prediction has a good chance as any. My theory is that these people, that is, the godless, were a splinter group who had the knowledge of the souls like the Ingwithans had, but didn't share their desire about being ruled over. And I'm just trying to avoid potential spoilers here. So the godless, by the way, are an ancient civilization that we know it lived in the living lands, but they are now gone for some reason. So we don't know why yet because we haven't played the game. I think these people were perfectly happy to be ruled without gods, so they used their mastery of souls to make devices and relate that to their own divine being, who would oppose the pantheon that we know as the Ingwithan pantheon. He doesn't think it worked for obvious reasons because, we didn't see it happen in history, but they think that their divine being still exists in some way and perhaps is just being suppressed by the gods. So I'm dancing around some of the words here because I don't want to give away anything narratively about Pillars of Eternity if you happen to be playing through it right now. But basically he's saying that the godless, even though they're referred to as the godless, that's other people who call them that. He's saying that the godless way back in the day, they had their god, and it was opposed to the god that we know. I call it the Ingwithan pantheon just for convenience sakes. It's opposed. These different deities are opposed to each other. And so the Ingwithan pantheon basically suppressed this god of the godless a long time ago. And it seems like now we are seeing that god kind of resurface. And this has to do with events from the end of Deadfire that would allow that to happen. I'm not going to spoil what that is, but just suffice to say that there is sufficient reason to say that if there was a previous god in the World of Eora, now is a good time that it would show up. So the gods had to ration their essence because they're under threat right now, and that's what the godlikes in this world have to do. This isn't a huge spoiler thing. You do discover it from playing Deadfire, or is it Pillars 1? Either way, that the godlikes that correlate to the gods that have touched them within the world, they are kind of, think of them as backup batteries in the sense of the god can basically just pull the essence out of a godlike at any point in time and use them as energy to sustain themselves. So you get to be a super badass person like a godlike and have these cool powers and look like a cool person, but at any point in time you could basically have your soul sucked out to feed your god as it is. That's not super spoilery, so I'm not too worried about that. But yeah, a lot of the reason that godlikes are disappearing from the world right now in the game of Avowed is very likely because the gods feel under some level of threat, but we actually don't know why that's happening. There could be another reason. That just seems to be the most sensible thing. But because the gods, the Ingwithan gods that is, feel under threat, and that's why they might be taking some of the essence from godlikes, they haven't been suppressing the voice as much. So this other god, which is referred to as the voice, is now no longer suppressed and coming back to the forefront and is back on the table, as it were. dbones90 says, our godlike status and the rise of the Dream Scourge Plague are the results of the voice coming back. We know godlike reflects the different natures of their gods, and I imagine that the voice is a divine being of pervasive growth, which makes sense because we have fungus growing on us, and fungus, that's a quality of fungus. It has pervasive growth. In the same way that spores spread invisibly and can lay dormant for years, the voice continued to exist in the world and just needed the right conditions to flourish. This is a lot of speculation, but I think it plays into what we know so far. I don't think the voice is going to be one of the pantheon, that is the Ingwithan pantheon I've been referring to, that we're most familiar with. And that's pretty much the end of the thing there. Now, if you have read his comment, or dbones90, if you happen to be listening, I did editorialize your comment a little bit, just in case some people are playing through any of the Pillars games here. You don't give away any spoilers, but you hint at them in little ways, and I want people to be completely surprised by the Pillars of Eternity narrative. So that's just me being more cautious. That's not a comment on dbones90 being flippant about this stuff. I am just a little bit of a worrywart when it comes to that kind of a thing, because I'm making this content, so I don't want you to be surprised by it. But there we go. And this is a pretty good theory, I would say, by dbones, and he goes into a lot of detail, basically saying that a long time ago, the godless people who existed in the Living Lands continent / island that the game of Avowed is played in, a long time ago, these people had a god, and that god was opposed to the gods of the Ingwithans, which is also the modern gods that we're aware of in the Pillars of Eternity times. And so a long time ago, these Ingwithan gods suppressed the godless deity. that we are calling the voice. And now that the events of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 have happened, there's reasons why the gods of the Ingwithans are maybe not suppressing the voice anymore, and they're trying to, like, a little bit more in survival mode, perhaps. And as a result, this deity known as the voice is kind of back on the forefront again. And so whatever it is that they were wanting to do a long time ago, they're trying to initiate those plans again. It's a decent theory, and I think it holds a lot of water. I'm not sure if I subscribe to it 100%, just because I think it repeats a lot of the narratives from Pillars of Eternity 1 in a way that I don't think Obsidian would necessarily do. I don't want to reference what those are because they're spoiler related. But then again, it is really a useful tool, I think, when you're designing narratives, especially over different iterations of a world or games, to have repeating and patterns of narrative. So perhaps that actually is something Obsidian is purposely trying to do. They are purposely trying to draw this direct parallel of the godless to the Ingwithans from the Pillars of Eternity games, so that perhaps maybe you'll experience the same level of wow, or have these epiphanies about the godless as people who played Pillars of Eternity did. I don't really know. So it's a good theory, and I'm definitely going to be like keeping that in the back of my mind as I play Avowed, as to when I ask the questions of like, what's going on here?
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
All right. So now that I've talked about different theories from all of these people on Reddit, I would like to dive into several theories that I have come up with. Not that I necessarily subscribe to all of these, but just different theories and speculations that I could come up with possibly being a reason for what is going on here. I have 6 in particular. I think a few of them are definitely wrong, but they hold enough water that I'm going to say it anyways. So the first one I want to kind of go through is if the voice that we hear in our head, which is known as the voice, capital V voice, is one of the 11 gods of the Ingwithan pantheon. It's definitely possible, right? Like, it's not out of the question that the voice could be one of the 11 gods that already exist in the pantheon, and they're just hiding their identity for some reason. There is a number of gods that it could be, because our godlike is associated with fungus. I already kind of theorized that Wall, Reemergond, and Galawain were 3 good options. Wall is the god of dreams and secrets. Reemergond is the god of decay, entropy, and death. And Galawain is the god of nature and beasts and monsters, amongst other things, as well as discovery. They're all really interesting gods, and they have a divine portfolio that is, I would say, really well spread out and kind of like comes at their personality from different angles. But if you want to learn more about that, listen to my episode about the gods themselves. So I surmise that those 3 are the most likely of the gods to be your deity if we are only using the Ingwithan pantheon, because Galawain, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on, is the god of nature, and you're a fungal godlike. So there's some connection there. I don't think that it's enough to justify it, but it definitely puts Galawain on the list as potential. I more lean towards Reemergond and Wall. I would prefer it to be Wall because he's my favorite of the deities. And there are some reasons to go and think that that's true. I touched on this in the previous episode about Wall being potentially your deity. One is that Wall being the god of dreams and revelations, there is this plague in the Living Lands called the Dream Scourge, right? So there is that connection to dreams there. And when I'm asking these questions, I think to myself, if I was a writer at Obsidian, why would I call things the thing I call them? Like, why would I call it the Dream Scourge? Well, because it has to do with waking nightmares. It's like, well, why would I design this thing to be a waking nightmare? Is it because the connection to Wall, like the writers at Obsidian already knew it was connected to Wall, so they called it the Dream Scourge? You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm thinking about the processes of how these things got their names. So the fact that it's called Dream Scourge kind of hints at it potentially being related to the god of dreams and revelations and secrets and mysteries. As well, the fungus that we see in the game of Avowed could be correlated to the fungus that we see in the Forgotten Sanctum DLC, which is related to the god Wall in the second Pillars game. So there is that correlation already there. Again, it's not a strong correlation, but it's kind of another like little hint that kind of puts it there. As well, the voice refers to itself as a we, not an I or an it or a they or whatever. It refers to itself as a we, and Wall often refers to themselves as a we as well. And an interesting thing about Wall is that this deity has the capacity to make itself forget things, or make themselves forget things. We see this actually happen at one point in a kind of a minor way, where they're like, oh, I made myself forget that was real. Thanks for pointing this out to me. So like the Wall has this ability to make itself forget knowledge. So the reason the voice might not refer to itself as Wall or reveal that information is because it's literally forced itself or themselves to forget it. So there's a lot of like little hints that say Wall could be this god. Now, I'm not going to dive into that too much because I talked about it in the previous episode, and I think I just kind of gave a quick summary here. Now, I didn't talk last episode about Remergond, and that's because that was something I thought about later. There is actually a lot of evidence to suggest that if the voice is one of the Ingwithan pantheon, it might be Remergond or something related to Remergond, and I'll touch on that in a second. The evidence that I feel supports this is that we have a note that is issued to a member of the Harbingers of Dusk, a member being Karlod. The Harbingers of Dusk is basically associated with the god Remergond. They believe that the world is going to unravel and end one day, and that we should hearken that. We should try to haste the world towards that and live our lives like everything's going to unravel and nothing matters. Anyways, there's this note written to one of the members of these Harbingers that worship Remergond, and they're talking about how their artwork feels more real here in the living lands, that there's some sort of pull here, there's some sort of magic, or there's some sort of thing going on in the living lands that makes it feel like their artwork is being more fulfilled as it relates to Remergond. And the reason I think that's important is because it leaves this little hint to suggest that there is something related to Remergond that's in the living lands that makes this person's spiritual connection to their artwork, which is Remergondian in nature, it feels stronger here. They have a stronger connection to that here in the living lands. So it makes me think that there's something about the living lands that's connected to Remergond in some way, shape, or form. As well, Remergond being the god of entropy and decay, fungus is related to decay and rot. And so you could definitely surmise that fungus is related to Remergond, and that's why your godlike is expressing their godlike nature in the form of fungus. So you would be a Remergond godlike. As well, in the note, there seemed to imply that there were other Harbingers of Dusk that were still alive, one in particular being a godlike called Vatnir. And it makes me think, well, if Vatnir is still alive, unlike a lot of the other godlikes in the world that have been disappearing, why has Remergond not eaten up some of his godlikes? Why do the Remergondian godlikes possibly still exist? And perhaps that's because Remergond, well, he doesn't really care about the end happening, actually, so it doesn't matter to them. But perhaps because they have some sort of backup plan, or they're up to something, and maybe they're the voice behind the voice. And this leads me to another theory that is related to all this, but kind of different, and that is that who the godless are in relation to Remergond. There is this really interesting thing in the history of the World of Eora. There is a location in the World of Eora called the White That Wins, which is basically a barely habitable place that is kind of like our Antarctica, except, people live there. And a long time ago in the history of Eora, these people, which are now on the modern times of Pillars of Eternity, known as the Glomfelin, they are the Pale Elves, they migrated from somewhere in the World of Eora down to the White That Wins. We don't know why. Like the tens of thousands of these Pale Elves went from wherever they were to go live in the southern polar ice caps, but for whatever reason, they moved from where they were to where they are. The interesting thing is when you look at their language, and the game points this out to you in Deadfire, that their language doesn't have anything that matches surrounding nations or cultures, such as the Nasitak, which is a different nation that lives nearby. But they share a little bit of linguistic derivatives, if you will. I'm not sure if I'm using that word right, but they share a little bit of the linguistic nature of the Adiran culture. And Adir is a different continent on its own, but the thing that's important about that for this theory is that the Adir Empire is not that far away, on the global scale anyways, from the living lands. So it's possible to surmise that the Glomfelin people, the Pale Elves that live in the southern polar ice caps of the White That Wins, it's possible that they migrated originally thousands of years ago from the living lands. And perhaps the Glomfelin, that is these Pale Elves, are actually the godless people from long ago, because the godless have ruins in the living lands, they're not there anymore. So perhaps the Glomfelin are the godless, just in the modern day times. Now, there are some reasons I could think why this would happen. There is a lot of evidence that suggests the god Remergond got the Glomfelin to migrate to the White That Wins, and it's also learned that he kind of perpetuates their souls there in a way that is against his own virtues and values. I'm not going to dive into it in case you want to discover it through playing the game itself, but essentially the Glomfelin are in this isolated region from the rest of the world, and their souls kind of stay there as well. Not necessarily all the time, but their souls kind of stay in that area. So it seems like Remergond is isolating these people from the rest of the world. And when you kind of correlate this back to some of the things we're talking about with the godless in the living lands, perhaps there was something in the living lands that Remergond didn't want them exposed to. Perhaps the godless of ancient times did in fact have a deity that they worshipped, and Remergond wanted to get them away from that deity that is somehow associated with the living lands itself. And this kind of ties back into D-Bone's 90s theory of the living lands is itself a deity. Or I guess, sorry, no, someone else said that, my bad. But either way, perhaps there's something with the living lands that is associated with this old deity that Remergond wanted to get them away from. So he moved them to the most isolated part of the world he possibly could, and he kept their souls there as well, and is just isolating them from all of that for whatever reason, because it obviously is a threat to him or other things. So when you put all this together, it really does seem like a substantially, like a decent theory. And that might also be a reason why Remergond is hiding his identity from you, the godlike, because they want to manipulate you into doing something that would perhaps destroy this deity. And he somehow sees that you have a unique ability to do so. Not sure what that is. Maybe you are actually a godlike of this old deity and not of Remergond, despite the fact that Fungus and Remergond could be related. But he's just using your godlike nature to destroy whatever that thing is. I don't know. I'm just kind of like throwing darts at the wall at this point in time. But that's definitely another idea. Now I'm going to dive into some other theories as well, but this episode's going a lot longer than I thought it would. But, you know, I'm also only releasing every 2 weeks, so I'm trying to make it a little longer. I touched on the previous episode that the deity that is behind the voice might be Yazuhin in nature. So just like how I talked about how the godless might be the early Glomfelin, or the Pale Elves of the White That Wins, there is another society within this world called Yezuha, which has long been separated from the rest of the world due to reasons that I'm not going to get into here. And the interesting thing about Yezuha is that they only worship one god, a singular god. They're monotheistic, rather than the rest of the world, which is polytheistic, and they worship the known 11 gods of the world. And when I say known, I mean very much known. Like, these gods talk to people. It is well known that they do exist. And so why the people of Yezuha only worship one singular god is we don't really know. We don't actually get to find out that lore within the game of Deadfire, but we do know that they refer to a single god. Now, if the godless people from ancient history and the living lands did have a deity that they worshipped, or they worshipped the living lands itself as a living being, because maybe it was, perhaps if Yezuha is a far-gone ancestor, or they're modern times and they were the godless, perhaps the godless people were an ancient ancestor to modern-day Yezuha. Perhaps they're still holding on to that idea of a singular god because that's what they believed thousands of years ago. Even though they've lost a lot of that history of who they are as a people, that ancient tradition of only believing in one god has stuck with them. And there's evidence to support this as well. If you watch the video of Mortismal's gameplay footage from Avowed, especially the story and speculation episode that he did, we see a clay tablet which is very clearly written in Yazuhin's script. And you can see that because if you go to the Strange Tablet in the Pillars of Eternity games, they're described in the same way, of this flowing vertical script that you've never seen before. And then when there's this book that Mortismal picks up for a brief moment, we see that there was this historian in the Living Lands that was saying they've recognized some similarities in the script of this clay tablet, which is Yazuhin, to the scripts that they see in the Godless Ruins. So there seems to be a correlation between the Yazuhin people of the modern times and the godless people that lived in the Living Lands. So there's some connection to them. And so my theory is that they had left the Living Lands, perhaps to go on some sort of inquisition or conquest, because we do read that they had gained an army to conquer the area of Yezuha. And while they were out there conquering the area of Yezuha, they ended up becoming isolated for, again, reasons we're not going to talk about. And that's why they're no longer in the Living Lands. And so the deity that the Yazuhins worship is actually the deity of the Living Lands. And the reason that it's slumbering is because its people that worshipped it and perhaps fed it in a way isn't there anymore. But perhaps now it's waking up. because we learn at the end of the Deadfire game why the Yazuhans are isolated from the rest of the world and like what's going on with them. And there is a reason why perhaps that god now might be waking up from its slumber, which is what the voice refers to itself having been doing for such a long period of time, is that it has been slumbering for a great period of time. And another reason that I do think that the Yazuhans are related to the godless is there is a section, again in Mortismal's video, where we see these locations that you can go to. It's related to some quests where you look into ancient memories in the distant past of the Living Lands, and we're seeing these NPCs drawn out in a very artistic and stylized way of these people in the Living Lands history, and they have red hair, which is a really important factor because the people of Yezuha, which are referred to as Stormfolk, have red hair. Like a lot of them have this like bright red hair. It is a stark feature of their people group. And so to see them, these ancient godless people depicted in these ancient memories that you collect throughout your adventures in Avowed, to see these people of the godless also have red hair, alongside the fact that there is the clay tablet that has similar scripting to the godless from Yezuha, it seems pretty obvious that the Yezuhans are related to the godless in some way. Perhaps the modern day Yezuhans are the same people group that were the godless. Now, what does that tell us about the voice or anything else? Nothing. We don't know anything about Yezuha, the god they worship, and the nature of all that. We just have nothing but speculation. But it's interesting to see the correlation being brought up there. But one theory that I surmised on the previous episode is that this deity, whatever it is, might be associated with the wheel, which is the cycle of reincarnation that exists within this world. You know, you die, your soul leaves your body, goes to the beyond, which is kind of like the afterlife, and then comes back. And that's the wheel turning. That's the cycle of reincarnation. And at the end of the Deadfire game, there is something cataclysmic that happens within the world, and it does affect the cycle of reincarnation in some way, shape, or form. And perhaps the one monotheistic god that these Yazuhan people worshipped, perhaps it had something to do with the wheel. And so the people leaving the Living Lands, plus as well some ancient history involving the wheel that changed its nature a little bit, perhaps that's why the ancient god of the Living Lands and the godless went to sleep, because it was no longer useful. It was also no longer being fed by its people in a sense. And I don't know how that works. I'm just kind of spitballing here. Perhaps that's why it went to sleep. And then as the results of the games from Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, it's now waking up again. And interestingly, the voice refers to Aethys as a false god, or at the very least, this statue being built in Aethys's image refers to it as a false idol in some sense. I'm not sure if that's because this voice thinks that the gods of Engwith are false for whatever reason, or because it just doesn't like them. The last theory I'm going to talk about, which is only 5, but I've kind of smushed 2 of them together by accident. The last theory I'm going to talk about here, and this kind of undoes a lot of the stuff I've already talked about, but it's still a theory worth talking about, is that the voice, which refers to itself as a we, are in fact the godless people. Perhaps the reason we don't see godless in the world anymore is not because they migrated to the southern polar ice caps of the White That Wends, or not because they went on an inquisition to a land called Yezuha and conquered it. Perhaps it's because they somehow found a way to meld their very consciousness and souls as an entire people group with the Living Lands itself. Perhaps they were under threat from the ancient Engwithans, perhaps, and they thought the only way to survive this is if we remove the souls from our bodies and we put it into the land itself. And perhaps they were successful in that, but maybe they, as a result of that, they fell into this deep slumber that the voice refers to itself in because of something unforeseen, or perhaps the Dream Scourge was something that was there in the world and this is their response to it. So maybe they were able to lock the Dream Scourge away by turning themselves into this, divine being. But now that the Dream Scourge has got out, they're awake again. So the voice might actually just be the collective voice of all the godless people from ancient history. And so now when it refers to itself as we, it's because it's referring to itself as the people of the godless, or whatever they would have called themselves. We, the people here, are now awake. And the Dream Scourge that we created ourselves in this manner and nature to keep away has gotten out. So now we're back here on the playing field trying to stop it. And this flies in the face of my old theory that the Dream Scourge was a weapon that whatever deity you were associated with as a godlike was using to get rid of, people invading the Living Lands. I'm now leaning more towards the idea that the Dream Scourge might actually be something of a threat. maybe cancerous in nature. Perhaps the Dream Scourge, which is fungus in nature, right? So that's why I kind of related it to your Godlike, and that's why I thought it was a positive thing for your Godlike. Perhaps it is a positive thing, but it's too much of something, right? So perhaps the Dream Scourge is cancerous in the sense of like it is running rampant and it is now out of control of the deity that we're talking to behind the voice. And you, as a God-touched, the godlike person of this deity, you're going to have a unique ability to actually do something about it. And you're going to have to use these ancient memories to help decide what to do or gain information on what exactly you're going to do to help fix the scenario. Oh boy, that's it. So I apologize for that just long rant of random information and ideas. For those of you listening to this show that are brand new to this series, a lot of that might go over your heads, I'm going to be honest, because there's just a lot of lore and information there that is really much easier to understand if you've played the games. I still tried to skirt around any spoilers. I even deleted a couple sections while I was recording this because I thought it was a little too close. But I think I did a decent job at explaining it. So if you've played the Pillars of Eternity games before, let me know if you think I need to expand on something a little bit more. worldofaora@gmail.com is the place to do it. But yeah, so this episode is largely for those who are familiar with a lot of that lore. If you find yourself new here, again, go check out episode 0, and that'll give you some signposts to certain episodes that'll give you a foundation of the lore. But more than anything, I would really suggest you play the games or watch a Let's Play of it, even just a Critical Path Let's Play. Because there's a really cool world that they've built over at Obsidian for the World of Eora that you can explore in Pillars of Eternity. And you don't need to play those games, for sure, to understand the game of Avowed. Obsidian has been very clear about that, but I definitely think it's not going to make the experience worse, really. But to each their own. Some people don't like those style of games. Totally get it. I didn't like them either at first. But yeah, so sorry for that long ranting style of an episode. This was just pure speculation, tinfoil hat theories, your guys' theories, my theories, just going crazy with it, and this is what we ended up with. So thank you, everyone, for your endurance and fortitude to listen to this long ranting of some random red-headed dude in Canada. But yeah, let's close out today's episode. But normally I would say, what does this episode's topic have to do with Avowed? But it's pretty much all about Avowed. Even though we talked a lot about the lore from Pillars of Eternity, because we're trying to use the lore from these two great games to explain and theorize what the hell is going on in Avowed and its narrative. Who are you as a godlike? Who is the voice? What's the Dream Scourge? I don't know, but here's what we got. So it's all really Avowed related. So I guess the only thing I left to do is to chat with you guys about what I've been playing so that we can have cool conversations about it. I finished Dragon Age the Veilguard. I think I'm the only person or one of a couple people in the Avowed cast crew, which is a different podcast, who actually finished the game. And I did all of the quests. I did all the companions, all the faction stuff. So I got a pretty good handle on that game. And I'll say this, I enjoyed it, then hated it, then enjoyed it, and then hated it, and then enjoyed it again. And then I was just rushing to get to the end. It was definitely not a game that matches the previous Dragon Age games. I don't think that necessarily means it's a bad game, but I do think that brought a lot of baggage in for people who loved different previous titles in that series. I think that game would have really had a better service done to it if it didn't necessarily have the title of Dragon Age in it. Like if it was just another game set in the same world as Dragon Age, but it was a very different style of game. I don't know, because as a game on its own, if it was completely divorced from the previous titles, it's really not that bad of a game. It has decent combat, it has some good areas of writing, the story is actually kind of compelling, especially if you've played previous games, so I guess it's not completely fair, but I really liked seeing the story arc for Solus in that game, for example. So I think it would have been better received were it not for the context of the series it's in. Which is kind of sad, right? Because you can tell people put a lot of work into it. And there is a lot about that game that is very well done. You would show people in video game university or whatever for developing games of this is how you do some things. They did a very good job. And this is one of 2 Dragon Age games that I actually played all the way to the end, and I really did enjoy it in a lot of senses. But I will admit, by the end of the game, I was just rushing past enemies to get to the end because I was just done. I'm I want this over. I'm in the final mission, so I'm skipping bad guys and just getting to the end, which is good because it means I was hooked into the narrative, but it's also bad because I didn't feel compelled to still engage with the content at the end of the game. I just wanted to get to the conclusion. Perhaps I'm just impatient, so that's a me thing. But I have moved on from Dragon Age the Veilguard to playing Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. And I gotta say, that game is great. I've only played 4 or 5 hours so far, but I am loving it. If it wasn't for the fact it released so late in the year, I really think it would have been a big Game of the Year contender. I still think the game that won Game of the Year at the Game Awards was well deserving for it, and I know there's some contention on the internet about that, but I mean, there's always going to be contention on the internet. I really think Indiana Jones would have had a big chance of winning Game of the Year. It is very fun, very cinematic, but it still plays like a game. It shows side quests in a way that I think are just brilliant. Like, you can just kind of randomly find them, which means you feel like you could have missed it, but I think the designers also made it in such a way that you're going to find things, because I go through that game not picking up a bunch of stuff, and then I feel compelled to all of a sudden pick up stuff in different areas, and I think that's because they designed the environment and all that in ways that it makes me want to feel explorative. So it's a really well done game. I can't wait to continue playing it and talk more about it here. If anyone wants to give me your opinions on either of those games, please let me know. I would love to talk to you about this kind of stuff. worldofaora@gmail.com is the place to do that, as well if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything you want to communicate to me. You can also follow the show at World of Eora on Twitter/X. I mostly just post updates on the show, such as things like, I'm going to be late for an episode, which is going on. Lastly, if you would like to support the show, there are 2 ways to do so. First, you can do ko-fi.com/World of Eora, and that's how you can directly support the show monetarily. I just use the funds from that for podcast-related reasons, except I give my wife $5 so we can go on a coffee date at Starbucks. But otherwise, I keep it aside for things like if I need a new mic or something like that, for example. So you can do that ko-fi.com/World of Eora. I'm not expecting anything. It's just there for people who like supporting the things that they enjoy listening to. So don't worry about it if you don't want to. The other way you can support the show, though, if you want to support us or support me here, but you don't want to do so monetarily, is if your podcast platform allows it, you can give a rating or a review, or you can comment on Spotify. Now, my son is trying to get into the room right now, if you can hear the noise in the background. Hey, buddy. You're just in time to help me close out the episode. You want to say goodbye? No, he doesn't. All right. Anyways, don't slam the door, buddy. All right. Anyways, thanks everyone for listening to today's long speculative episode about the game of Avowed. I will be back either next week or the week after to talk about either the apocalyptic literature that we see in Deadfire, or perhaps some backup episodes that I found in my files of other lore. Either way, thanks for everyone for listening. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.